Welcome to Constellations, the podcast from Kratos, where industry leaders share their thoughts and experience on the future of space business, policy, and opportunity. If you like Constellations, please support us by giving a rating and review on iTunes. And don't forget to share this podcast online to help our community grow.
Welcome to Constellations, the podcast from Kratos. My name is John Gilroy, and I'll be your moderator. Today, we have Lluc Palerm, Senior Analyst at NSR, and Chris Boyd, Vice President of Product Management at Kratos. And where are we? We're in Washington, D.C. at the Satellite Show, right in the middle of the thick of things here. And I think if you look around the room here, I think many people don't realize that the satellite industry just makes up 1% of the much larger global telecommunications market. And that's what these gentlemen are going to talk about today, the telecommunications market. You know, I think there's a huge opportunity for satellite service providers to gain a large share of the market if they adopt key technology enablers to seamlessly integrate with telecom carriers. So that's the topic today, telecommunications. Lluc Palerm, Senior Analyst at NSR, and Chris Boyd, Vice President of Product Management at Kratos. We're going to talk about new market opportunities where satellites can extend today's global communication network. The conversation will also focus on how satellite service providers can seamlessly integrate with telecom carriers to deliver these new services. This conversation builds on a recently released report from NSR titled Telecom-Satellite Digital Network Integration, the Keys to New Market Opportunities. So let's just jump right in here. We're going to start off with our friend from Spain, Lluc. So looking in the past year, you've been in the business a while. So what has limited the satellite industry from integrating with telecommunication systems in the past, and what makes this integration much more critical moving forward?
Thank you for the invite to be here. And I think that that's a very good question to begin with, because before we start analyzing how we can do to expand the satellite market, we need to understand what we were doing wrong. So I think that the industry has changed a lot in the last 5 years, and I think that the first thing is performance and economics. So if we think about the industry 5 years ago, the performance wasn't as good as today in terms of throughput, in terms of capacity, and the economics. The economics has changed a lot. So prices of satellite capacity has gone down, prices of equipment has gone down, and it's now possible to serve rural communities, for example, with a much more economical solution via satellite. Now, what's the next step? So I guess the next step is making satellite easier to be adopted by the general telco ecosystem. And I think that there are a lot of things to do there in terms of how the mainstream telco can manage and check the SLAs, can integrate the networks in the satellite ecosystem as well. And also, satellite requires a lot of particular skills. So if we can make satellite easier to adopt by all this telco ecosystem, the opportunities for sure are very, very big in the coming years.
So Chris, from your perspective, what do you think is limited in the past?
So certainly I think the limitations have been the stovepiped and siloed type of operations that we've seen. There's some proprietary system integration levels. And so what you had is essentially a boutique or a niche business that the telecoms really had some trouble. I mean, back in the day, they actually could do it pretty well. But as the telecom business has scaled, automation's crept in. And the satellite industry hasn't really embraced a lot of the automation and the buzzword being orchestration. So a lot of those tools, I think, were preventing it. And I think Lluc hit on a good point. The skill sets were different. They're now starting to converge. So I think there's those things are starting to ease. The opportunity I think Lluc also hit on was the cost structures, right? So we're seeing now a lot of bandwidth capacity coming online, which is driving the cost down. So it's making satellite one of the attractive for certain businesses to provide use cases over satellite. So that's starting to get the attention of the telcos to say, well, I can now adopt that to the mainstream technologies. But only if I can integrate it with my current business, with my current workflows and orchestrations, and only if I can do it at scale. So those are some of the, I think, pieces that we're working on as an industry.
But Chris, if you looked at the telecommunications industry, when VoIP was broached about 15 years ago, they had to be dragged into it kicking and screaming. So it's not just the satellite industry that are stuck in silos, is it? I mean, they were stuck too.
No, and we've seen this 3, 4, 5 times. If you go back to the PBX, to VoIP, as you mentioned, you saw it in land mobile radio systems. You saw it in the mainframe to the computer. We're now seeing it in cloud. Telco's doing the same thing. So, to say we'll avoid it in the industry is pretty naive, actually. So.
Yeah. Luc, a question for you here. What market opportunities should satellite operators and telecom carriers jointly pursue in terms of service delivery, especially with satellite strengths in serving remote and underserved locations? So give us some examples of some of these services.
Right. So nothing really totally disruptive and new. I think it's going to be pretty much the same kind of applications that the industry serves today, but the scale is going to be totally different. So we think, for example, in cellular backhaul, and we do a lot of research on cellular backhaul. We have done a very detailed analysis on the addressable market based on the distribution of the population that is not covered and the available income and so on. We think that there are 22 terabits per second of addressable market. So that's huge. I mean, if we compare that with the 3 terabits per second of supply that we have today in the industry, I mean, it's 10 times the capacity that the supply of today. So there is a huge potential for growth. And that's just for backhaul. Then you have other use cases like in-flight connectivity, maritime, all these kind of services that the telco industry is looking forward to serve. If you think about 5G, one of the key areas, one of the key focuses of 5G is expanding into enterprise services, and satellite can be a great partner for those telco operators wanting to expand into private networks, into rural areas, remote areas, and these kind of services that the industry is already serving today, but the scale is going to be very different.
We know Luc's from Spain, and Chris, I think you're from Boston, right? Okay.
I live in Boston.
You live in Boston. Well, in Boston, they have this team called the Red Sox, and they hate the Yankees, and they'd never think of ever working together. So when I think of satellite operators and telecom carriers jointly pursuing terms of service delivery, it seems like Boston Red Sox fans and Yankees fans get together, huh?
I don't know if it's that separated. Actually, I think there's they just want to play baseball. Is kind of the way I look at it. But
just want to improve communications.
I think Luc had a good point. I think you have to look at the net new opportunities. The satellite industry can't disrupt necessarily what they're doing. As you were pointing out, there's a lot of cellular backhaul, maritime business, things like that. I think where it has to make sense for the telcos is where they can match that to their existing product suite. And so I think some of the opportunity here is to look at net new business together, not stealing from other markets that satellites already got good market share in. So in places that we're obviously the only people that can serve those types of services. So I think net new opportunities where we can align the order management, the provisioning, right, the scale factor that Luc mentioned. I think that's really key. So the telcos are going to look to that. That has both a operational configuration, but also the actual technology alignment.
Chris, earlier I talked about VoIP, Voice over Internet Protocol. I think the term Ethernet is kind of a malleable term, and there's all kinds of ways to slice it and dice it and change it up. And if you go to Wikipedia, you have pages and pages of different types of Ethernet. So what is this carrier Ethernet, and how can it enable satellite and carrier networks to interoperate more seamlessly?
So I like your analogy. That's a great way to describe it. So Ethernet is ubiquitous. Carrier Ethernet is actually a very specific definition. Actually, it's a set of standards managed by the Metro Ethernet Forum, or the MEF. And specifically, Carrier Ethernet 3.0 is the standard that's currently available. And what Carrier Ethernet provides is a standardized set of industry-aligned methodologies to provide carrier-class Ethernet services, but also to map critical aspects of that, like quality of service, guaranteed bandwidth, et cetera. The other thing that's critical about Carrier Ethernet is as a customer connects to even a terrestrial Carrier Ethernet, there's a defined service architecture that they get when they ask for a particular service definition. So that defined service now becomes between the customer and the provider as a defined service, but now between providers, we can exchange services from one operator to the other on a similar or the same service definition or service architecture. So it allows for a very specific way for us to then transport the customer's traffic over a technology agnostic layer. So now if you look at that as applied to satellite, the access layer doesn't look any different to a telco than a fiber link or a terrestrial copper link or what have you. So it is an important movement, I think, within the satellite industry to align with the standards so that we're all talking the same language.
Chris, I've been around a while, and I remember in the early days of data centers, when you provisioned a data center, you went out and you bought a server and you physically hauled it in and hauled the bad one out. And so provisioning means different things to different people. So I'm going to apply this word provisioning to this carrier Ethernet thing. So if satellite networks become more flexible like carrier networks, how will services and resources need to be provisioned differently and much faster than the past? It's not you going down and getting a server and plugging it in, is it? It's much different.
And nor is it just provisioning a piece of fiber or copper, right? So in our world with the satellite, there are lots of dynamics. Obviously, the satellite has its configurations. The ground system has its configurations. The link budgets associated with the coverage are there. What we're seeing in the industry now is a shift to software-defined payloads, and we really need to take advantage of those because now instead of having to launch a satellite with a configured orbit service definition, now that can be adjusted mid-lifespan or at any time, frankly. So what we're seeing is the need to align now the services to the satellite and the satellite to the services. And to do that, we have to actually include the satellite in the resource planning. And so what's really critical is to have when you provision a service, to consider what is the satellite's resource plan, does the satellite plan need to be adjusted, then the ground system would have to change to match. And so what we're seeing then is a fully dynamic scenario where we might want to change the configuration of all of these elements. The key is to do this at scale. It can't. Earlier in the conversation about space domain awareness, it's getting to the point where humans can't be involved. So now we're needing to actually have these systems automated and have loops and feedbacks. And so now the idea to have a satellite resource manager in the configuration of the service is actually quite critical.
Yeah. So Lluc, you've been in the business a while. You've seen this change drastically from drive down and physically put in a cable or a server to something completely. Actually, looking at the end product, the software-defined payload, it's changed drastically.
I mean, I see the conversation revolving around technology, but I think that the business model itself needs to change a lot. So we focus a lot on the infrastructure itself, but I think that the industry needs to think as well on how the offer changes to make it much easier to adopt from mobile operators, for the general telco ecosystem. So that's probably a point that it's sometimes missing in the mind of the industry that I think we should pay more attention as well.
No, it's a step-by-step process, this integration. Chris, question for you here. Well, as operators consider adopting some of these steps we discussed to better integrate with telecommunication networks, so how do they start? What's the first step? How do they start the process, and what challenges should they be aware of to minimize risk and make sure they're successful?
So kind of like we were saying before, I think you can't just wholesale apply this to this right out of the gate. We have to look at the markets and the use cases that make sense. We were talking about a few of those a few minutes ago in terms of selecting the ones. And then I think we have to look at the use cases and the business cases that make those opportunities close. And I think that's the key thing to understanding how we get there. The second is obviously we're talking about telco and satellite integration. So we have to have the right partners, right? We have to have a satellite provider who knows how to deliver these types of services. We have to have a telco who has a business need to serve the disconnected or remote applications. And then I think there's a set of technology choices that have to go along with that. And so we need to look at, what are the right technology sets to adopt to be able to facilitate this? What are the business arrangements between the two companies in terms of service level agreements? So I think there's a number of steps that have to happen from the business, focusing on the opportunities and then the technology. And I think those things you will automatically start to see the ones that boil up pretty quickly to the top as those that will make a lot of sense right out of the gate. And then I think the rest of the industry will learn how to apply those things to other vertical markets.
Lluc, you have a good international perspective. In America here, when you're meeting with a company, before you leave the room, you say, okay, what are the next steps? And then I write down, and Chris writes down what the next steps are to implement this. So from an international perspective, what do you think about these next steps to minimize risk and ensure success?
I think that the very first step for the industry is taking a holistic view of the things, right? So we still see many of the satellite operators thinking just about the satellites and not about the ground segment. So that's not possible in the future with software-defined satellites, with all the orchestration, integration with the telco ecosystem. So infrastructure alone doesn't have a differentiation value in the future of the industry. So you need to take this holistic approach where you think about your satellite and how this integrates with the ground segment and how this integrates with the partners on the telco side of the equation.
So Chris, let me get this straight. So people like you have to step back and think about the payload as a service and every step along the way right down to the ground station. I mean, this gets a pretty long checklist. You have to have several Excel pages of checks on this, don't you?
And all the way out to the terminal. Let's not forget about that part. And you can't have pages of checklists. You need to automate it.
Well,
so
of course.
This is part of the problem. I think you guys were hitting it right. And the other thing I would caution is, so as you were mentioning, like the satellite is going software defined, right? The payloads are adjustable. The ground systems have to keep up. And so there's a couple aspects of that we absolutely have to embrace. So obviously the satellite industry has already embraced virtualization from a technology perspective. And, everyone says, well, why did that cost me more money? Well, virtualization never was intended to be free. It certainly has its cost. The next thing, in order to achieve the scale that you were mentioning, if I'm going to connect the satellite to the ground dynamically, then I have to be able to very quickly change the ground system, and that includes the IF. So the second part of that is really digitization. So there's a number of things going on in the industry now to take the IF from analog to digital. And that's really critical because as you regroom the satellite, we need to regroom the IF uplinks and downlinks to match. And those processes are what's going to drive the changes. So again, just like virtualization is not free, digitization won't be free either. That's why I was saying, going back to the business cases, the things of the satellite being dynamic and the ground needing to change, those are going to force automation. And to do that, you've got to take the humans out of the loop, and you have to be able to do this through automated processes. So again, I think it's important for people to understand those are investments that are made, and we have to look at the ROIs of those things. And what the total cost of ownership of those things are to understand, and again, back to my earlier point, figure out what market use cases make sense to attack first.
Yeah, Luc talked about a holistic
That's
view.
right. It's a business, the whole business cycle, but also the technology cycle. And so now we're at a point where to achieve some of this dream that we have about integration, we have to follow what the telco industry has also done. They have also automated their digital layers, the software radios. So they're already expecting that from us to be on the level playing field, or we're going to be playing, in your analogy, farm ball, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Luc, I teach in a school a few miles from here. I always ask my students, well, where do you see yourself in 5 years? And I try to structure lectures based on where they see themselves. So how about looking in the future for you? That's part of your job at NSR, isn't it? So how do you think the role of satellites will have changed in terms of telecommunications service ecosystem in the next 5 years?
So I think we are in a very, very good time. So I'm very positive about the future of the satellite industry. We think about all the players that are now getting interested in the satellite industry. You see all the big telco operators now signing partnerships with the satellite industry. So that's very encouraging. And we see a lot of growth in verticals, again, like backhaul, mobility, private networks. So we think that the industry is going to grow quite rapidly in the coming years. Again, we'll continue to be a small share of the total telco ecosystem, but even if you grow from 1% to 3 or 5%, it's a massive opportunity for the satellite industry.
Yeah. Chris, what do you think?
I agree. I mean, if you look at the telco industry, they have a long set of standards and technologies that they've rallied around. 5 years ago, satellite would not have been even considered in those standard bodies. So, for example, in the MEF, Metro Ethernet Forum I mentioned, there was not a satellite performance tier. So you actually could not achieve a certified service through the MEF using satellite because the latency profiles of the geo satellites in particular. So it was actually a satellite operator that pioneered some of the addendums and changes to those standards. And similarly in 3GPP, which is the driver behind 4G and 5G standards, they have also adopted things to accommodate satellite like non-terrestrial network, which is a part of Release 17. So what we're seeing is now the telco standards bodies accommodating satellite as a technology because of the inherent issues with our particular physical attributes. So I think that's really key to having them start to acknowledge that we're coming viable to their space and then starting to align. And again, I think the key to the satellite industry, back to your first question, is I think adoption of standards and reduction of proprietary systems are really what the telcos want from the industry because they've already started to disaggregate the rest of the business. So they're going to see some of that here as well.
I mentioned my students earlier. I tell my students that free is not a four-letter word. Because we have a free report for you. There's a table down here, and it's a report that NSR came together. It's called Telecom-Satcom Digital Network Integration. So if you want to pursue this further, maybe in a written print format, it's right here. We've got a couple minutes for questions from the audience before we close it up here. Any questions for our guests? Gentleman up front here.
Hi there. My question is, do you reckon that high-altitude pseudo-satellites could pose a challenge to sort of satellites in like cellular backhaul? And whether they'll take any of your guys' market?
Okay.
We don't see them as a competitor. Rather, it's more a complement. So maybe the high-altitude platform will communicate with the end device, and the backhaul will go through satellite. So there are opportunities there I think there is room for all these kind of solutions to work together. It doesn't need to be a substitute, but it can be a complement.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's a good point on the high-altitude platforms utilizing satellite. Obviously, there's some people in this room thinking about ways to use satellite to relay different orbits together. So I absolutely agree. I don't think it's necessarily a competitive threat. Each orbit will find its critical use.
Each orbit will find its critical use. We should put that in a T-shirt or something. It's pretty good. Well, in the movie Back to the Future, there's a car, and it had a license plate. And the license plate was out of time. And I'm afraid I'm out of time here with this individual podcast. I'd like to thank our guests, Lluc Palerm, Senior Analyst at NSR, and Chris Boyd, Vice President of Product Management at Kratos. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, John. Appreciate your time.
Thanks for listening to Constellations, the podcast from Kratos. If you like this interview, please subscribe, tell a friend, and give us a review.